So do you need an LLC for your rentals or your real estate business in general? This is one of the most common questions I get asked. And so today we're going to share with you what an LLC actually is, trying to decide if you actually need one for your business. We'll talk about some of the pros, cons, and the things to think through when trying to answer this question for your personal situation. And lastly, at the end, I'll share with you guys my corporate structure, how I've set things up, and how I started versus how it's kind of evolved along the journey. But with that, guys, let's jump in and talk about what an actual LLC is. You can look up all the different definitions you want, but in my terms, it's really a corporate entity that allows for lots of operational flexibility. It allows you to very efficient tax processing. We'll talk about all the details there, but most of all, it's just a very watered down and easy to use entity compared to its counterpart, the C corporation, or just corporation. So as you guys know, I am not an attorney or a tax professional, so always seek professional guidance before making a decision. But I do think I have a lot of insight and experience that will help you form your own decision. So let's kick things off talking about why LLCs are so popular for real estate investors and the two primary answers to that. We'll start off with the least primary first, and that being the tax flexibility. So LLCs essentially allow for something called a pass-through, or they're considered a pass-through entity, which I'm not going to dig into the details here, but essentially they're not taxed as a corporate entity. Anything you make or anything you lose that's held within that LLC passes through to your personal tax return. So all you really need to know is a very easy tax process when dealing with LLCs. But again, your CPA will talk more about that. I would say that's a very small reason why people do this. The number one reason why real estate investors and business owners in general like LLCs is for asset protection. All right, and so when we talk about asset protection, I want to just kind of talk through this in a little more depth because I think a lot of people get the wrong impression here. So when we think about entities and LLCs, you really have to think about yourself or your social security number or you as an entity. And most people understand that when they think about themselves, they understand the tax implications and the legal implications of conducting yourself in public. And so when we look at yourself as an entity, in this example here, this is your entity and everything that's owned by you. So your house, your bank accounts, your cars, any assets that you own in your name or kind of under your entity. And so when you start to acquire rentals and you acquire them in your own name, you continue to put them in the same pool as all of your other assets. And so where that could become risky in the sense that when you buy rentals, you are taking on additional risk. And there are low-lifers out there that like to, slip and fall and try to go after landlords. People think that rental property investors have all this cash and we have a big target on ourselves. So let's say in the worst case scenario, or the example that you hear about a lot, someone buys a property in their own name. So they add that to their personal entity or their personal assets. Someone slips and falls on the ice out on front of your rental property and they try to sue you because you didn't have the proper handrail in place. And so when they sue you as your personal entity, they can sue and go after everything that you personally own. Okay, so if you truly neglected not having this handrail and the courts did decide with the tenant, they could go after your personal residence, all your cars, they could garnish your wages, essentially take everything that you have from you. Okay. And so when you set up an LLC or a separate entity to hold these properties in that same scenario, you own 4 properties in this LLC, they could essentially go after everything the LLC owns, but they couldn't come through and get everything you personally own. So it kind of protects your personal home, your wages if you have those, anything personally that you own, or anything in another LLC that you have. It kind of just, the idea is to keep the guards around the things that you're willing to risk, and so that you kind of segregate that risk or protect your assets. Coming back to that term of asset protection. So that is the number one reason why people go with an LLC for these rental properties, is really just to segregate that risk. And so that example that I just talked through does have a lot of assumptions baked in that you do everything correctly when you set up your LLC and operate it. We'll talk through in a minute kind of what some of those downfalls could be with associated to an LLC, but just want to put that caveat out there that this is not a silver bullet. Just assuming that you set that up doesn't mean that you can't ever be sued or no one can ever come after your personal assets. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of magic pill. This is all in theory here that we're talking about, assuming you do all the things, you cross your T's, dot your I's, etc. All right, so now that we know asset protection is the primary reason we set this up, let's talk about some of the downsides or considerations that you have to think through before you immediately decide to go this route. So right off the bat, there are some administrative setup costs, dealing with the Secretary of State, attorneys, drafting operational agreements, documents, etc., just associated with kind of that admin setup cost. So it's really not a whole lot of headache, but there is an operational cost associated to doing this on a yearly basis. So there are things that you have to do to continue to maintain your LLCs. It's not something you just open, forget about, and continue to conduct business as prior to setting up that business. All your LLCs have to have separate bank accounts that don't commingle at all, don't mix funds together with your personal funds. Everything is kept separately. You have to keep documents in place, certain meeting minutes on a yearly basis, etc. There are many requirements that you have to keep up with to keep your LLC in good standing and to get the benefit of the doubt when it does come to these situations that we talked about before. If you don't do any of those things, and then we go back to that original slip and fall on the ice accident, the courts could say, you just set this up on paper, you didn't actually operate your business like an LLC, so we're just going to assume that those were part of your assets and come after them anyway. So this isn't something you just set up and forget about and assume that you can't be sued, you got this bulletproof protection. So I want to make that point very clear. So it's critically important that you're very organized when you go about this whole process. And then the second con or downside to an LLC is when you're just starting out and you have the benefit of taking advantage of residential lending, usually up to 10 properties. It's very difficult to get lending directly to an LLC. You just want to be aware of that as well. There are some ways around that through transferring after, but that comes with its own set of risks that I'm not going to dig into in this video. So just be aware that there are some challenges associated with the LLC. And again, not that one size fits all approach. So let's circle back to the original question of, do you need an LLC for your business? So two questions I often ask people to just get your gears turning and start thinking about this correctly is, first, if we're doing this for asset protection, do you have assets that are worth protecting? Meaning, I talk to a lot of folks who are, kind of just getting started. They have student debt. They don't have a lot of equity. They don't have a lot of cash in the bank. They're buying their first property that's very high leverage. They're putting 3.5% down. So if we think about it from a lawyer's perspective on how suable you may be, or how much could they squeeze out of you if they were to sue you, you really don't have a lot for someone to go after. So, if you own a property that's, worth $100,000 and you bought it for retail, you put 3.5% down, so you have maybe $3,000 to $5,000 in equity, is a lawyer really going to pursue that case knowing they can't really get much more than $5,000 to $6,000 out of you, right? Or you have $10,000 in your bank account. You're not really that suable, versus the case where you have a paid off $100,000 property and $75,000 in the bank. Now you may want to consider, protecting yourself that way. So always think through that, what's your risk tolerance and what do you have to lose? You want to think about that before you decide what you want to protect. And then the second consideration is, could you solve the problem a different way? So if you are worried about the downside, you're very risk averse, there are other products tailored specifically for transferring risk, and that is via insurance. So the first piece is making sure the subject property has very adequate insurance. Depending on the different types of property, you just want to speak to a good insurance agent. I recommend an independent agent, so someone who gets quotes from multiple different companies and can build a tailored product based on your specific needs. So I would recommend reaching out to them, then very clearly letting them know your concerns so they can build a product specifically to help mitigate that. So I always recommend a heavy umbrella policy. That's, if you think about it, an umbrella kind of covers you in any case. It goes above all the limits on your personal underlying policies. Again, won't get into the details there, but you can solve the protection issue with a very good insurance policy or policies. So I hope that was helpful to think through all of those considerations. And lastly, as promised, I want to talk to you guys about the way I've structured my company and properties over the years. And just keep in mind, I didn't start out this way. I did start out buying my first property in my personal name. And that's the thing here. You can build this as you go, make changes as you go, and modify. So don't get overwhelmed and think you have to have everything figured out from the beginning. But I will just talk you through this, mine just for theory, and just kind of sharing maybe the end state or something to think through. So I do have 3 separate LLCs that I do hold different properties in, kind of for me based on 2 primary criteria. One is overall property value and overall property risk. For example, I do hold 3 single families and 1 duplex in one of my LLCs. It was kind of my original LLC that I was putting all the properties in. Once I had more than 1, I did decide it was time for me to open an LLC. And then when I went to buy my 12-unit apartment building, that was from a value and a risk perspective, a higher perceived risk and a higher dollar amount that I didn't want to put those assets in the same LLC. So I did at that point decide to create a separate LLC just to segregate all of that risk. And then I do have a separate LLC that I kind of hold, I guess, more non-desirable properties or properties with a higher perceived risk there. So when going off market and buying properties, sometimes you have to buy a package, or a seller wants to sell 4 houses all together, but I only really want 2 of them. This is where I hold while I'm, coming up with an exit strategy, or if it's part of a seller finance deal, this is where I'll hold those in the meantime, and just to kind of segregate that risk and keep that separate from kind of what I think of as my bread and butter LLCs, or what's really keeping the lights on, if you will. I do have separate LLCs for other businesses that roll up as well, but from a holding standpoint, that's primarily spread out through 3 LLCs. And then all of those LLCs, I do have 1 trust that is the owner of those. So I personally am not an owner listed anywhere on any of my properties. And another benefit I didn't mention before, you do get from this, very low benefit in my mind anyway, is just the anonymity perspective. So for someone trying to figure out who the owner of a property is, for me, they have to go through and look up who owns the property. It's owned by an LLC. Then they look up who the owner of the LLC is, and then they find it's a trust. And then they have to go figure out who is the owner or the beneficiary of that trust. And it just creates a lot of headache. And so versus the scenario where, someone looks up a property, see John Doe's owns it, and they think it has a high equity position, and they're looking for a target. So again, very low benefit, but it is very important to some people. An LLC can provide that benefit of anonymity as well. So guys, I hope that was helpful. If I missed something or you have a question that I didn't cover here, drop it in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, a like or subscribe are free ways to support the channel, and do mean a lot to me and the YouTube algorithm altogether to help other people find the channel and help me continue to grow. But guys, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap. I'm Tyler Wayrung, and we'll catch you next time.